You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, Gavin.
Hello.
Hello, Fia.
Howdy.
Hello, Mike.
Good to be here.
Hi, Will.
Hello, David.
And hello, everybody out there in the world. Welcome to the Common Descent Podcast. This is Spotlight 2024, a series we're doing throughout the year where we sit down with our fellow podcasters, science communicators in paleontology and the like, and talk about science communication and such. This episode, we are joined by the hosts of I Wish You Were Dead. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, we're happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's always a challenge to coordinate some kind of Zoom call or anything else with 5 people at the same time.
Definitely.
Yeah, we appreciate you guys having us on and sharing your platform.
Yeah, we like to live dangerously. Why make it easy on ourselves? Now, Gavin, we've worked with you before. It is very nice to see you again. Fia and Mike, we just met for the very first time. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into more discussion, I would love it if each of you could introduce yourselves for our audience.
Absolutely. Gavin?
Yeah, go ahead, Fia. You spoke up first.
Okay. Okay, so I'm Fia. I was the newest addition to I Wish You Were Dead. I think over a year ago now.
Oh, it was well over a year ago.
Yeah.
To be clear, you are the only addition we've ever made. We've only had one lineup change. Yeah.
True. Yeah, I am a marine ecologist. I got my master's at LSU, and I'm doing my PhD at the University of Florida. And yeah, that's me.
Cool.
Do you want to go, Mike, or do you want me to go?
I mean, I think you should go next. You're the leader here.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Gavin. I am a paleontologist, although these days I don't do a ton of paleontology in my day-to-day. I'm currently the lab director in the Department of Geology and Environmental Geosciences at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. That's central Pennsylvania-ish, only about an hour from Penn State, where I know David went.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I got my bachelor's. First I went to community college. Always a big advocate for that, so I like to talk about that any chance I get.
Nice.
Then I went to my local 4-year school in central New York, and then went way out west to the South Dakota School of Mines for my master's in paleontology. And then COVID happened, and I realized how poorly just society understands anything about science, realistically. And so I tried to get into doing SciComm sort of full time. I looked into some other grad programs and stuff, but there just wasn't sort of in the cards for me at the moment. So I decided to look for a more stable job and then just do this podcast, just hanging out with some friends who were interested. And we'll talk, I'm sure, more about how we started the podcast in a bit. But yeah, that's me.
That's Gavin. And I am Mike. And if you were to ever play one of those games as a kid, like which of these doesn't fit, I am the one here that doesn't fit in as the one who is not a science person. My role on the podcast is to be kind of like straight man, dumb guy to make sure things are simple enough, which is a role that I play very well. My day job is as a social studies teacher up in central New York. And I've done that this is my 6th year teaching now. So every now and again, we have some history stuff that comes up on the podcast, and I can speak to that a little bit easier. But when it comes to the science stuff, I am as uneducated as just any random person on the street. So it's nice to have something explained to me by Gavin and Fia as we go throughout these episodes.
I will say he sells himself a little short on that. He's definitely picked up some things.
Yeah.
Over our, I think we just had episode 131 or 132. So every now and then, I'll mention something and he'll say, "Hey, I know that word."
Right. That's about as far as I mean, we've talked about this before, and like we had a whole episode on it actually. But yeah, so it's that's part of why we do the podcast, is so that way even people that aren't super big science people, or people that want to get into the field, you have some sort of barrier to entry, or a lower barrier to entry, excuse me. And so I think that's part of why we work so well together, in addition to just being 3 great friends.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's excellent. And I want to sort of continue on from what you've already started to explain here and encourage you to explain what is your podcast like. If our audience after this discussion is inspired to go listen to I Wish You Were Dead, which they totally should, what can they expect from your podcast?
I think they'll find it fairly similar. I listen to every single one of your guys' episodes.
Thank you. That's how you get invited on.
Yes.
Is nice things about us and you be a big fan.
Number one fan.
Yes.
But yes, we frequently shout out our number one fan of the pod, which for a long time was Fia.
Right. Yep.
And then we just made her co-host.
Yeah.
That's kind of what happened with Allie.
Yeah. Yep.
But now currently, I believe that is my mother-in-law, Molly, who also listens to pretty much every episode.
And who is delightful, by the way. Hi, Molly, if you're
Yes.
listening.
Mike has met Molly out in California. Yeah, I think they find it pretty similar. I think we do our best to not be as jargony as possible. And if I do get a bit jargony, that's what Mike and Fia are for. And it's nice having sort of the different tiers of knowledge where I bring the paleontology expertise, if you can call it that. Fia has a science background and the biology background, but not the deep time or the geology sort of side.
Right.
Of it.
Yeah.
And then Mike is the everyday layperson. So it's nice to have those different layers where if one of them is like, hey, I don't know what that is, can you explain that more? Or they're often very good at coming up with different analogies for different things than I am, because I'm just more versed in it. So I also like to send them images like paleo art of whatever taxon we're talking about at the time, and I like to have them describe it how they would.
Yes.
Those are some of my favorite moments when we're just like live reacting to artist renditions of some dinosaur.
Yeah. It's like, it looks like a porcupine, but it has the head of a bear, and I don't know, I'm just like making this up.
8
But
feet tall, yeah.
yeah, it's good.
And I mean, I can talk a little bit about kind of the genesis of all this, at least kind of in a nutshell here. But I mean, the reason why all this started was because we hang out, the three of us, and we have a larger friend group, and we love to get together. And Gavin was always telling us about this or that story from when he was out in the field, or this thing he learned, or this new project he was working on, and they were always just the coolest stories.
Typically with a couple of adult drinks. So occasionally I would, overemphasize certain things, as one does.
And it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gavin, but I feel like I had been sort of half bugging you about starting a podcast for a little while, just because you were such a great storyteller with all this stuff in a way that felt accessible to everybody else, at least certainly including to me. And your response was always, no, I'm too busy. No, I don't know how. No, I don't want blah blah. And then I feel like this interaction took place over Facebook, where I think I recommended that, and you gave me no. And then I said something to the effect of, well, what if somebody else took care of all the logistics and you just had to talk for an hour at a time? And it was like a sentence that had never before occurred to Gavin. The skies opened up. There was new possibilities all around. And so I think it took us a couple of months to go, and we couldn't settle on a name at first.
Yep.
We were trying to get all the logistics, but basically it was, the idea of, hey, look at Gavin, you are so incredibly good at this, at just explaining what you do for a living, to all of us, just, when we're sitting around, having a good time, or taking pictures and showing us, let's record this. Let's, hope let some other people hear this. And then I think it was December 2020, January 2021, somewhere right around there.
Yep.
We started knocking out the first few episodes of I Wish You Were Dead.
Which I should also quickly mention, our tagline is I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. And we decided on that to sort of encompass, because I didn't want it to just be Mike myself talking at Mike for an hour. At the time, it was every week. Why we decided to do that, I'll never know. We're now every other week.
Yeah.
But we didn't want it to just be me talking at him. We wanted him to have some sort of, more stake in the game. So it started off with every episode, he would do a Today in History, where he would just talk about, hey, on this date that the podcast airs, here's this cool thing that happened. And then eventually we got it sort of a rotation of I forget which it is, but every episode that ends in 5 is a Mike episode. Every episode that ends in Fia, or
Every episode ends in Fia.
I swear if you edit that out, like,
That's staying in.
every episode that ends in 0 is a Fia episode. Those might be switched. I don't remember which is which off the top of my head.
It's not important.
Yeah.
As long as you can count to Fia, you're good.
Yeah, exactly.
We also just really liked the name I Wish You, because we could not come up with a name. And then was it Shay, our friend Shay?
No, I think it was actually our friend Kevin.
Our friend Kevin, just like out of nowhere dropped I Wish You Were Dead. And we're like, that sounds awesome.
Yep.
It's a touch provocative. You may want to see what it is. And it perfectly encapsulates what we do. And that's, if you listen to the show, kind of going back to your original question, you're going to get, Gavin, who is both incredibly knowledgeable in his field and somebody that, is both good at and cares a lot about being able to actually communicate what he's talking about very well. And so that's part of why, we were all so happy that this actually finally came together and wasn't just, an idea that some people had that like, oh, we should do that, but it'll never happen.
Yeah.
And I can actually remember the Facebook post that I posted that instigated Mike to be like, hey, let's do this. My grad program, I guess, was one of the relatively few that requires a summer field camp like during grad school in the summer between your 2 years of your master's.
Yep.
And so we were out, kicking around in, central South Dakota, and I was about to climb up some rocks, and I saw this very large rattlesnake that I was conveniently right where I was about to put my hand. And so I calmly backed up, and I was like, this is going to make a fun story, though. And so I ended up posting the picture of the rattlesnake on Facebook that day with some kind of quippy, I don't remember exactly what I said, but some kind of quippy line. And that's when Mike was like, hey, you should start a podcast. And I was like, I'm in the middle of grad school. I really don't have the time. And I believe vaguely his exact words were, what if some idiot did all the work and you just talked for an hour?
I happen to know an idiot who's available.
I believe my exact comment was, hey, you're an idiot.
So as to sort of continue that story, I'm curious to know then, Fia, what made you interested? What did you see in this podcast?
Yeah.
If only a Fia-shaped gap.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so we all met like in upstate New York. That's where we're all from. And I, in 2020, moved to Louisiana to kind of start working in marine work because that's what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm working as a tech. Like I'm processing like just intense amounts of boring samples, and I'm like, I need something to listen to. And so like I started listening to Gavin and Mike on their podcast, and it was just such a great experience, one, to learn about new things, but two, to just like kind of feel almost like connected back to home, because I was so far away. I was missing all of my friends, and like just listening to them and their bickering, and it just sounded so familiar. It was like I was in that conversation. And then after every episode, I'd be texting them and be like, oh my gosh, this part was so funny. Or, oh, did you know about this thing? And yeah, I don't really remember how it happened. If either of you remember how it happened, but somehow I just ended up joining the podcast.
I do have to say this, Gavin, I'm not sure exactly what our downloads, our listenership is now. But like back then, like we had like 8 people that would download it. Never mind people that would it's not like we had people busting down the door, giving us feedback and stuff. So just knowing that anybody was listening, and not just like listened, but like was like making notes and texting us in every episode and was like looking forward to the next one. It was like,
sure.
It felt really good, in the same way, Fia, that, you said it kind of gave you a slice of home. It was just nice to know that, not just anybody, it feels good in a different way when people you don't know appreciate the work you do, but, to have some friends appreciate what you're doing and text you and kind of give you that appreciation. That was nice and appreciated at the time. As far as how you actually joined, were you a guest on an episode?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we did an episode about reefs.
Yes. Okay.
And that is what, and then Fia, if you want, you can talk about this more. That's what Fia was working on was oyster reefs down in the Gulf.
Ooh,
Right.
cool.
So we did sort of a joint where it's like I talked about reefs in the past, all throughout, the big rudest reefs and all the other different reefs throughout history and how just ecologically important they are and how they leave such excellent fossils. And then Fia sort of handled the modern extant reefs.
Yep.
So we did that as a joint episode. I want early 30s somewhere. I'm not nearly as good.
That was my
at
recollection, was 30s.
remembering episode numbers as you all seem to.
Just him.
I know. When I'm making notes for my episodes, I always have to put it in the notes because there's a handful I remember off the top of my head, but we're over 130 episodes deep.
Oh yeah.
If I can remember 10 off the top of my head that I'd go back to frequently and reference, that's good enough for me.
We did recent episode 36.
Yeah, I have to write the episode number for the episode I'm leading to make sure I say it right
for
at
the
beginning.
current episode.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because I will very often be one or two off. Where I'm like, this is episode 186.
Yep.
186 coming up.
We had the same thing. Whenever I'm introing, I do the intros for our episodes, and usually we start recording, everybody clap, get in sync, blah blah, and then God forbid I ask before or look at our notes. I'm like, what episode is this? Like I cannot keep track, nor do I know.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, and I'm the exact same. Whenever it's a Mike or Fia episode, I'm the one who intros it, and exactly the same. Even though it's only two numbers it could be, I still have to look.
Yep.
Now, one thing that I think is really interesting, as you mentioned before, Gavin, and as is kind of coming out in this discussion, our podcast and your podcast have some broad similarities in the general structure. Multiple people talking about a particular topic within paleontology. But I think one of the really interesting differences is that on Common Descent, it's me and Will, and we are basically the same person.
Yes.
Yeah, our background is almost exactly the same thing.
Yep.
I remember we had a listener comment way back, like in the first year, who was like, "This podcast is really cool, but it'd be nice to hear the hosts disagree on stuff."
I think it was after one of our screen episodes where we talked about a movie and we were in complete agreement on all parts of the movie. And it's like, it sure would be more interesting if they didn't have the exact same experience.
And I think that, as you were mentioning before, one of the things that really defines the experience of your podcast is that you are three people with three different backgrounds, three different levels of engagement in this main topics of these episodes. Why did you choose that? What do you feel? What do you find the benefits of that structure to be?
I mean, part of it wasn't choice, I don't think. Part of it was just kind of we had what we had.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know. I think the pieces of your today in history, and then I haven't mentioned this yet, but I do before, when I was working on oyster reefs, I did a swamp corner where I would introduce a species in the swamp and kind of talk about that and just do a little snippet of what's going on there. And then I switched over to seagrass as I moved to my PhD, and now I'm studying seagrasses. So I think that it's also a little bit for us too. It's a little bit to give everybody what they want, we love to hear Gavin talk about paleontology, but it's also nice to hear a random fact about history or learn about a weird new aquatic species. And I think it just gives you a little bit of a variety to kind of warm you up to learning about this really long, whatever topic we're about to delve into.
Yeah.
The change in styles is definitely nice. Gavin being, a bit more of the kind of the straight edge science guy. I say straight edge meaning regular science guy, not straight edge, like that term is otherwise used. Right. I'm coming, is kind of like the crazy history dude. Fia, as mentioned before we started recording, is a woman, which brings a whole new dynamic to the podcast.
Yeah, that was a big thing that we joked about a lot before Fia joined us. And it was also, 2020 into 2021. Every pair of white dudes on the internet had a podcast.
Yep.
What's that like?
Yeah.
So that was an interesting dynamic change for sure.
And a welcome one, to be clear.
Yes, very good.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate how you all have in different ways mentioned that your diversity not only lets you bring different info to it, but also kind of check each other to be like, hey, we'll pause it. That word you just used, what? And that's something that we've often talked about that we try to do to each other, but because we have the same background, there are definitely times where we will both miss something. and then someone in the comments will be like, what in the world? And we're like, oh, right. Yeah, no, that's not a thing that is used in day-to-day conversation.
What does et al mean?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's
We've
a great
never
question.
explained that.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the trickiest area that I found, where it's very easy to get jargony and very hard to sort of make it more understandable for the uninitiated, is taxonomy. Just because it's like every family name is a long word that sounds kind of funny, and there's really not another way to say that, especially for some of the ones that people aren't already familiar with, where it's like, with equids, I can just say horses. People will know what that means. Amphicyonids, bear dogs, for the folks at home, they aren't around anymore. People don't know what those are, but it's a lot of them don't have catchy names like bear dogs, so it's just kind of hard. And that's when I get into sending them pictures of paleo art of the different groups that we're talking about, and have them real time to sort of word vomit what the creature looks like. And that's, again, like Mike said, some of my favorite segments on the podcast is doing that.
Definitely.
Well, and it sounds like, and you were saying before, sort of poking fun at Mike about how Mike has been learning and catching on over the course of the podcast. But it sounds like that means that part of the educational experience of your podcast is the hosts learning something.
Yeah.
That
For sure.
the audience, and in the case of both Mike and Fia in slightly different ways, the audience is right there on the podcast, part of the experience, learning this information.
Yeah. I mean, like, obviously we want people to listen to the podcast, but I think that it was always a priority for us to learn something too, as in me and Mike.
It's also, with my day job being as a teacher, kind of spend, most of my days trying to take topics that can be reasonably simple to somewhat complex and try and, distill them down into some basic elements, to make them understandable to kids that, differently than people who listen to our podcast and are choosing to listen. I've got a lot of students that don't want to be there. I have a lot of students that they are only there because they are legally required to be there. I've got to find some way to make it not just understandable, but interesting. And I like to think I've gotten, pretty good at that over the years as a teacher. And I think there is some element of that I'm able to bring, almost as like the student in this case, where, as we're going through and, I'm trying to learn things, what does that word mean? Tell me what that is, explain it another way. And also, every now and again, there's some science words that sound kind of funny. And I absolutely make it a point to laugh at those and to have Gavin repeat those words as often as possible. In part because I'm 12 years old and that stuff's hilarious, but also just as a way to keep things interesting for anybody that might be listening and the podcast might seem a touch over their head, is kind of a way to keep things grounded for us. So that way we can also get to the real kind of meat and potatoes of what it is we're actually trying to learn. Yeah.
And I remember one that sticks out to the point of just being a little bit of a joke episode. This was before Fia joined us. It was just Mike and I. And it was toward the end of my master's. I was real deep in the writing, and I didn't have a ton of time to prep an episode. And especially at that time, we were still doing publishing every week. It was around the time when there was some news that came out about Psittacosaurus cloaca.
Yes. Yep.
And some just having an excellently preserved cloaca, which having that in general, just that being preserved at all is remarkable, let alone how well preserved this one was. And so I just took that news and made it the episode, more or less.
Yeah.
And obviously, cloaca, there's a lot of jokes to be had.
I think the most popular article going around about that was Riley Black's article, which was titled something to the effect of, we for the first time we've seen a dinosaur's butthole.
Yes.
And it's about Psittacosaurus cloaca.
Yes. So that's one that sort of hangs out in my brain. But yeah, that's just one that I look back on fondly with, even though it was very rushed, it was still a really fun one to record, just because oftentimes it's Mike cracking jokes, me cringing a little bit at the jokes, and then me being like, yep, that's a joke, moving on.
We have episode 53 was about the baculum. As requested by our audience, and also we got some comments after that of people who were like, that was a lot of immature jokes, and we were like, that's right, it's baculum episode.
Yep. Nope, we edited that one. We had to hear them all twice.
Now, Speaking of that topic, one thing that we've had asked of us by our audience a number of times is people want to hear about the process of preparing and finding information and putting together information for podcast episodes. And I'm curious to hear from you all. What is sort of the general process for you of choosing a topic and then going about getting the resources that you need for it?
It's incredibly easy for me. Like I show up once every 2 weeks, and all of a sudden there's a whole new 6-page script and stuff to talk about. So it's certainly no problem for me.
Yeah, very often our calls start with Mike, the sounds of typing with him like, what even is today's date? What happened today? And even frequently when it is his episode, it will not be prepped. So we typically record at around 8 o'clock. He typically will not know the episode topic until after he finishes teaching that day.
But they're all good.
Not throwing shade at all at Mike. That's part of the charm of the show.
Gavin, you are underselling it. There have been times I have not, on the Rare Mike episodes, there's been times that I have not picked mine until about 20 minutes before we start recording.
Oh my goodness.
It's in true lesson prep style.
For everybody out there that has never taught, like if you thought you had like a really good teacher and they always had it together and everything, I've got some news for you. Like, no, they didn't.
Yep.
Some of those great lessons were done last second, which can be some of the best. But so I mean, that's right. We're obviously kind of joking here about this. Gavin, Gavin's the one that does the main work on most of our episodes, so he can speak to the kind of the prep behind all that.
Yeah. So these days I prep 80% of our episodes because, like I said, every 0 or 5 is one of the other hosts, and so basically I have sort of a running list of like general topics. Or general, I guess, realms is the better phrase for it, I guess. So we've had like a running series of going through each period, or now we're getting to the point where in all the different epochs of the Cenozoic. And we just sort of talk about that for an hour from start to finish, what the globe was doing, what life was doing, any extinctions or different, cool groups of life that people might be familiar with when they crop up, stuff like that. A running list of different people that are important in evolutionary history or geological history. For example, our most recent episode like that was about James Hutton, who is like very classic geology 101, like lecture 1 or 2, but who a lot of people have never heard of, unlike somebody like Darwin. Or even we did an episode about Louis Agassiz, and oh boy, that was a tough one. There was a lot of racism in that one.
Yeah,
that was a tough one to prep. But basically, and your teachers, if you're still in school, your teachers will not enjoy me telling you this. I usually start at Wikipedia.
That's where we often start.
Yep.
I make it a point to my students to say, I know your 7th grade English teacher was really upset that you have it easier than they did, but Wikipedia, when used correctly, is one of the best resources humanity has to offer. Like,
Yeah.
It really is.
I stress that to my kids. You got to use it correctly. There's some do's and don'ts, whatever. But like, it is truly one of humanity's like greatest achievements.
For sure.
Yeah.
It really is.
Right.
And so I typically, the only page that I kind of stray away from on Wikipedia is just the general evolution page, just because a lot of people don't like evolution. And so I'm like, of all the different Wikipedia pages that I could use as a resource for the show, that's probably the one that's most likely to have somebody trolling and messing around with it a little bit. Nobody, no matter how dedicated they are to not enjoying evolution, they're not going to go to the Wikipedia page of, one of the sub stages of the Eocene epoch, for example.
Yes, exactly.
So by and large, science Wikipedia is very reliable. The only downside is that it might be a little out of date.
Yep.
Yeah.
In which case, to sort of make up for that, I follow lots and lots of people who are both current researchers and also sci-commers. Like, for example, I have notifications on for Tom Holtz on Twitter. 99% of what he posts are just recent paleo news.
Yeah.
People like Tom Holtz, Darren Naish, Riley Black, people like that. And so I sort of start through Wikipedia, get the general gist, and then sort of fill in any gaps by going to, trusted, reliable sources, if you can, call Tom Holtz a source for things like that. And then just sort of fill in the gaps sort of from there. and obviously it varies from topic to topic,
Mm-hmm.
how you go about that. If you're talking about like a different family of, animals, we're very animal centric on this podcast, as I'm sure you can relate to.
What's that like?
Yep. I don't know.
And even much to Fia's chagrin, very vertebrate focused.
Yeah. It's okay.
Yeah, so that's generally how I go about it. I do, read probably 3 or 4 papers per episode, which is less than grad school, but still work.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that's the general process, which I'm sure is probably quite similar to your guys.
Yeah, lots of parallels.
Well, I do think that it is interesting and valuable for people to hear, because we've had this conversation. People will ask about where we're getting our information.
Yep.
And we also, like Mike said, like to point out that we're using sources like Wikipedia,
Yes.
at least to get started.
Yeah, and like to get an idea of what because a lot of times we'll pick a topic and it's like, what even are the sections that we need to cover for this?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah, exactly.
I don't even know what the beats for this one are. Like some things, it's like, okay, I know how to talk about that, and I need to find the details. Others, it's like I don't even actually know what all there is to say about this.
And I think that it gets at an interesting challenge with navigating information online is, like Mike said, knowing how to use it correctly, knowing which resources are good and valuable resources and which resources are maybe put together by less reliable or more misleading sources.
Or outright malicious sources in some
Or
cases.
sometimes outright malicious
Yep.
sources. And I think that it's nice to reassure people, because it can often feel so daunting when you say, well, you can't use Wikipedia, you can't use any of these common things.
Mhm.
And it can leave people feeling like, well, then, but that's where all the information is.
Well,
that's what I
right.
know.
Yeah, and that's the one that I have access to. Like, I don't
Right.
Yeah.
I don't
read those
have a
papers.
university that I can get all the papers through, or I'm not used to reading papers.
Mhm.
Yeah,
and
just
even-
shot down the one site that I can use.
Yeah.
Or the site that comes up first every time I search for something. Like,
Yes, exactly.
Right. When y'all like first posed this question, I was like kind of embarrassed. I was like, oh, I use Wikipedia. Like, I don't know if this is like frowned upon, but like that's what I use. And I was so relieved to say that you guys use it too. I was like, oh, okay, good.
Well, and it's to the point where it's like hopefully my thesis advisor doesn't hear this. I used an not insignificant amount of Wikipedia as a springboard for my master's thesis. So it's like, if it's good enough for my master's thesis, it's good enough for our dinky little podcast.
Well, Wikipedia is nice because, number one, there's tons of references.
Mhm.
Primarily, that's why I'm
Right.
using Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Is you go
Right,
down to the
yeah.
bottom, you look at all those references,
Exactly.
or read through the page and see what that's an interesting sentence. What is being cited here? Where's the information coming
Yes.
from?
Yeah.
But also, Wikipedia is sort of an informal review. If you can find a review
Right.
paper from last year, that's awesome.
Terrific.
Yes.
Fantastic. But those aren't always around.
Well, and
Right.
I like using Wikipedia as did I miss anything a lot of time, because if I go, because like my go-to is a lot of times I gather papers and I use their introductions,
Yeah.
where it's like, all right, explain the background of the thing you're talking about, because that's mostly all I need. I don't need the specifics for this one specimen you did a study on. I need you to sum up the group for me so that I can do it in the podcast.
Mhm.
But I'll do that, and then every now and then I'll go to Wikipedia and go, oh, none of the ones I grabbed mentioned this that Wikipedia mentioned. Is that because that's nonsense, or because that's just not typically what the researchers are talking about? So, and I can go chase that tidbit down. So Wikipedia is a good way to gather up those. And at least I like to look at that, because that's what other people are going to find. If they look up the topic where our episode is on, they're going to find Wikipedia. They're going to see that sentence and go, why didn't you mention that? I said, all right, well, now I can say, you'll see this. Here's why that's not actually talked about much, because it's not actually as valid, or it is, it's just not studied or whatever.
Yeah. And that's definitely the case with, I definitely find myself leaning on Wikipedia in particular more on, for example, our most recent episode at the time we were recording this was about the Eocene epoch, just front to back. My master's thesis was mostly focusing on mid to late Miocene stuff. So it's like very different global conditions, even though it was only, a handful of tens of millions of years later. But it's like, especially with all the climate shenanigans going on in the Eocene, way over my head.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely, when we get to the Miocene, when we do that episode in a couple of months, I can kind of do that off the dome. But with especially way back when we were doing like, the Silurian. So it's just so convenient to have, like you said, David, the springboard to start from and then just sort of spread out across the internet from there. I'm also lucky in that I work at a university, so I have access to more or less any paper I want. That is an extreme luxury that the vast majority of people don't have.
Mm-hmm.
So that's typically all that to say that's where I get my sources from, at least.
Yeah.
Right.
Just going off of that, talking about finding things that are kind of at your level. Two kind of strategies that I use, because sometimes, particularly when we're doing these big sciencey things, this happens sometimes when I need to learn something for a class I'm teaching. I pull up even the Wikipedia article, and the Wikipedia article is too dense, or there's just so much there and it's hard to get through.
Yeah.
One thing, and I'll teach my students this, is number one, instead of Googling topic and going to the Wikipedia article, if you just Google like the topic for fifth graders or for middle schoolers, and you'll go to some Science for Kids website, and that's usually like perfect at being able to explain something at my level, for whatever the topic is. And I am absolutely shameless about doing that and showing my kids, my students, how I do that.
Yeah,
in addition, there's also a little Wikipedia hack. This isn't for every Wikipedia page, but if you go to any Wikipedia article, it'll say in English, en.wikipedia.org/whatever. If you change that en and you make it simple.wikipedia.org, you get, for a lot of the bigger pages, you get just like a much simpler, much shorter breakdown of whatever topic it is. And there's less well sourced, less going on. But that's kind of the point, is if you are truly, out of your depth on something, and Wikipedia sometimes can be a little bit too much, there are, still some other ways to get the information you need. And that's part of what we, again, going back to kind of the whole thesis of our show, is just trying to lower the barrier of entry.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
For all these things. And there's a million ways. Instead of gatekeeping and saying, oh, you can't use one of the most popular sources, let's talk about how we can use that source well, and also some other strategies when that source might fail you.
Yes, absolutely. I did not know that about the simple. So that's
Wiki Simple.
That's cool.
I'm really happy that you brought it up, and I got to watch everyone else in the call be like, oh, really? And I was like, ooh, that's great information to know that that's not as widely known, because I had assumed that it was, because I knew about it.
Yeah, and it's not right. Like, not. I wish more people knew, but that's why I tell my students, especially my high schoolers that are going off to college soon, I'm like, you guys are going to have to take some classes that you don't want to take, that you just need to pass. Like, if that's happening, you got to write some paper on a class you never showed up to. Here is step 0 in kind of getting your way through whatever course you need to. That's not important. It won't get you your major. Like, whatever you're majoring in, you better know better than that. But for kind of the bare bones stuff, or just to learn about something cool, that you might be out of your depth on, it's a great intro.
Yeah, or if your professor just isn't giving you the info, if you just have a professor that is not explaining it, here are the tools so that you can swim instead of drown.
Absolutely.
I do think that it's really nice. And Mike, you've said this. Fia, you mentioned it before with your feelings about admitting to using Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. One thing that we try on our podcast to do is to be honest about when we are hitting topics that we're not very familiar with.
Yeah, not present ourselves as all knowing for the facts. Yeah,
Gavin, you mentioned topics that are sort of you're out of your depth. Mike, you mentioned that, and I thought this was a great point, that some Wikipedia entries are nearly useless to me.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's so technically written. It's basically like reading
all the mathematics Wikipedia pages are just...
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Math and engineering stuff.
A lot of chemistry as well.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the like this specific version of evolution will often be about the statistics of how that's measured.
Right.
And I'm like, you still haven't told me what it does, though.
Yes. So I think that it's really valuable to be honest with people and say, hey, we're not going to go into this topic in this episode because we don't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't read this whole paper because this whole paper is an absolute slog to get through. And I'd have to read 7 other papers just to understand this paper.
Yes.
So this particular topic is just not going to be featured in this episode.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something, when I'm teaching that I run into on occasion, and there's kind of 2 schools of thought. There was somebody I knew who was talking about, their first year teaching, they were teaching a course they weren't super comfortable with about something. And, kids would ask questions all the time. And he would answer those questions. He didn't know what he was talking about. He said there was a whole lot of interesting history that got created that year.
No.
Right. There is the projecting the all knowing I am the sage on the stage. And then there's, I think, when you get more comfortable at your job, whether it is me
Definitely.
teaching or just talking about stuff on a podcast or whatever it might be, just the comfort in saying, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Someone go look that up, or we can save that. I'll learn about it and we'll talk about it next time.
Yeah.
Yep.
But just the ability to say I don't know, to not feel like you need to look like a know-it-all,
Yes.
Right.
to prove yourself to whoever it is your audience happens to be, is it's, for me, it's kind of one of the hallmarks of should I trust this person? Are they willing to say,
Yes.
I don't know, that's out of my depth, or I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah.
That it is okay to not know everything.
Yeah.
That was one of the main things back when I trained tour guides, that I would tell them is it is okay. You don't have to have an answer. None of the guests are going to get mad at you for not knowing.
None of the reasonable ones.
Yeah, exactly. And if they do, then that's when you call one of us or security, because that's a person that can get escorted out.
Yeah.
But like, if they ask you an overly specific question, very often when you go, I don't actually know. That's a good question, but I don't know. They're usually like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, I just was curious.
What I will say, the one thing that's rough in parent-teacher or I shouldn't say parent-teacher conferences, open house is where this comes up, when you've got parents coming in, just meet the teacher, hey, how are you? Nothing specific, but it's all mom and dad are in there, and mom's been greeting all the teachers all day, and they finally get to me, their history teacher, and like dad all of a sudden speaks it. So you're the history teacher? Like, yeah. And he's like, oh, I love history. I'm a real history buff. I'm like, oh, are you? And I know at that point I'm in to hear some obscure and he's going to go brag to all his friends. Oh, I knew blah, blah, blah. The teacher didn't know this. Like,
yeah.
And I'm sure it's a World War II thing as well.
Oh, it's almost always a World War II thing. You ever met dads? Oh my God.
What they subsist upon.
Oh, right. So there definitely are times where where I want to pretend like I know more and you don't have to explain this to me, but that's just that comes with the job, that comes with the territory. There's always somebody that's going to want to teach you something, and as long as it doesn't last forever, you can usually learn something.
Yes,
I think that this does speak to a lot of people have that idea in their head of, can I one up this scientist or expert, because there is that expectation of you said sage on the stage, which I think is a very fun concept.
Yes, that's a teacher term. Yes,
I like it.
You're an expert or you're a scientist, and therefore you're kind of expected to know everything. We've talked about this when we talk about movies and such, where it's a common trope in movies that there is one scientist character who knows everything. All the exposition is coming from this person. Because
they know all information in the world except for sports and cars.
Right.
And that's it. But they know history, art, and science all at the same time.
But
I think it's like a medical show trope as well.
Yes, exactly. Where they are an expert on every part of the human body.
Yes, right.
As if your actual doctors aren't also Googling things.
Yes.
And I do think that it is a valuable part of that to recognize is the pressure that can put on people who are teaching or people who are communicating science. Returning again to Fia's point about not wanting to admit that you use Wikipedia, which I have absolutely felt before when people are like, recommend a resource. And I'm like, well, I can't say that I don't know this thing or that. And I think that that expectation provides a hurdle for us as scientists, as teachers, as psychommers to overcome and be able to admit those things, to admit that we are still learning and that there are things that we are taking shortcuts or things we don't know yet.
Right. Yeah.
Gavin, has there ever been an episode that you wanted to do that you just don't feel comfortable, or like you want to talk about XYZ thing, but you just you either don't think you know the information well enough or don't think could present it well enough?
Most things with plants.
What's that like?
We got a person for that.
Yeah. So we have, out of 131 episodes, we have done a total of 2 about plants. One about plants in general, just as a primer, and then one specifically about grasses, because I'm like, most of my study group, for especially being the Miocene, for my thesis was horses, which horses and grass, peanut butter and jelly.
Yep.
So of all the plants, those are the ones that I know the most about, which still isn't a lot. So that's it. But I would love to do more episodes about plants just because they are so bizarre and so fascinating, but I don't understand plants almost at all.
Yeah.
And hopefully, Fia will help us out with that,
I'm
as
working on
she
it.
progresses in her PhD with all those sea grasses,
Yes.
conveniently not grasses.
Tell you what, Fia, like you've got plenty of time because it's not like I'm nipping at your heels anytime soon. So
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like going back to kind of that like uncertainty, I think when I first started on the podcast, like I was very, very nervous to even just do my little like 5 minute, like this is my species I'm going to talk about, because I was just so afraid it like that. And I was also young and didn't know a lot of things about science yet. And so I had that built up expectation of like, you are communicating all of these things and everyone is listening and the pressure is very high. And if someone hears this and they know it's wrong, they're gonna something bad, like just some bad thing is gonna happen. When in reality, like it's not that big a deal. I mean, like we're all people and we're all doing our best to try and communicate science. And I really like when, like, Gavin, you're definitely like a good example of this. When you're not sure about something, you really emphasize that you're not sure about it. And I think that that definitely helped me get through like kind of this transition period when I was first learning to science communicate on a weekly basis. And then I kind of got more comfortable and more comfortable. And now I feel like, I'm gonna do my research and I'm gonna give it my all. But if I don't know something, it's okay.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And there even was a smidge of somebody, and this is, I'm being a little facetious about this, of somebody, quote, sort of commenting on something we said in that quite early on.
was this your professor?
This was my thesis advisor.
This was when we found out we could receive voicemails. I don't know how on earth that worked, but it did.
I don't even know if this is still a thing. But we hosted the podcast on what was then Anchor, but is now Spotify for podcasters.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to like our page on that, you can leave us like a voice memo.
Oh,
Which
we don't recommend it
didn't
because we might not see it.
yeah.
Right. We had no idea that was even a function until my thesis advisor left us one thing, not really critiquing us on anything. He was very nice about it. But so he works a lot with camels, and I do not like camels. And so their taxonomy is horrible. The entire thing, no matter how you try to resolve it, just comes up as a big rake. And there was quite a lot of camels in my group that I was working with during my master's. So I frequently would comment how much I don't like them because they would never help me with anything. They would just get in the way of what I was trying to do for the most part. So I would just sort of flippantly joke about how much I don't like camels. And then he left us the voice memo about how to stop bad mouthing camels. And I was like, I'm going to cut that and put that into an episode.
Yes.
So I did. And then a little while later, we invited him on as a guest to tell us all about camels. But when I first saw that, I was like, oh no, what did I do? And, knowing him, I know he didn't really mean anything by it. But there's for sure, Fia, there's definitely that instinct that, everybody always wants to, it's just that first instinct in just broader society to want to correct people.
Yeah.
And particularly as a scientist, there's also like, I don't want misinformation out there. So I want to try to correct things. And maybe there's a little hyperfixation on that as well, particularly with paleontology for me. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there is that instinct and you hate to be on the receiving end of it. So definitely, I
and there's also the element of imposter syndrome. You combine, wanting to do all that with, oh God, I'm not, I'm not good enough to be able to do this. I had that, the first time I walked into a classroom and like, they were my kids. I was hired. I had a job and like I'm not a teacher. Like like they shouldn't let me do this. Like they're going to find that I'm a fraud at some, I spent the first, I did not get a whole lot of sleep my first couple of months teaching because I was so afraid of because I was lesson planning the whole time. But B, just like, I was terrified that they were going to find out I was a fraud. Mm-hmm. And like, thinking back on, all the good teachers I had that made me want to do this. Like, I'm sure we all have kind of, the people in our lives that, that kind of inspire, or like, we aspire to be, some version of them. Like, Dave and Will, I'm sure you guys have, some science communicators that you guys have kind of looked up to as you kind of started your media empire at this point.
Ooh, I like that. I like the sound of that.
Excellent. We're
That's
gonna
a nice
start
ring
telling
to
all the
it.
sponsors.
Yeah. I mean, what was the impetus behind you guys starting everything behind a Common Descent here?
Yeah, we started after we graduated,
Mm-hmm.
and it was an idea you had for a while
Mm-hmm.
of doing a podcast.
Yeah.
But part of the push was we had both become educators,
Mm-hmm.
and we were now both no longer in academia, so we were not keeping up with the science, and we did not like that. We could feel that we were losing track
Okay.
of the stuff. So we wanted an excuse to give ourselves homework and have to learn it while also getting to do SciComm, which we already had decided we wanted to do as our path.
Yeah.
And there was
Yeah.
a similar element to what you all described about we were having these kinds of conversations
Yes.
about science, and we thought
Mhm.
this could be cool, put together in a structured way, in a way for other people to hear it. And that has become an emergent theme in these discussions we're having with other podcasters, that it often ends up being people saying either this is a conversation that's already happening, let's put a mic in front of it, or this is conversation we wish was out there.
Yes.
This would make a great podcast. It doesn't seem
Mhm.
to exist yet. Let's become that podcast, or let's put this conversation in a space where people can hear it.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, but that's fantastic, right there. And again, just like the ability to have, you guys have each other here, so that way you can both bounce things off of each other and strive to, be each other's best, and also build each other up when possible. And, it's the same thing with us. We're all, the three of us are all, nervous about putting something bad out there and want to do as good a show as we can.
Mhm.
And I can look at, listen to Gavin and Fia and know that they're both incredible and do such great work.
Aw.
And still be nervous about, my role. And then they do the same thing for me. So just part of what I think is so huge about, having these kinds of conversations and doing, this kind of work, as big or as small as it might be, is just having people that you trust around you that number one can validate you and can help you, make sure you're comfortable with the work. And then also, that gets reciprocated back
Yeah.
around. And I think that's, is such an important dynamic to, certainly the team we have. It sounds like the team that you guys have, and just, kind of working in groups in general, is being able, having that kind of reciprocity of feeling comfortable with each other
Mhm.
and knowing that, okay, if this person here says it's good, then I'm happy with that. I'm willing to trust, what they said about, what we're doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I think the trust is a big part of it, because as much as we have kind of joked that Mike does maybe less prep for his episodes than I would do, but I trust that he will find something, or at the very least, he will make it entertaining.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you go.
I have considered at times, and I still might do this on one of my episodes, just completely making something up. And
Oh,
just
no.
it sounds,
it's not going to work now.
but I want to see how long it would take, because it would start off sounding real, or grounded in some amount of reality, and the story would get more and more absurd.
Mm-hmm. That used to happen with me and my friends with animal facts, because I'd mess with them and tease friends back in the day more than I do now. But then I'd share some animal fact, and they're like, "No." And I was like, "No, for real with this one." And it was very much a boy who cried wolf because I mess with them in other times when I'd say some weird thing about, spiders eat their silk so they can redigest it and make a new web. They'd be like, "No, they don't." It's like, they do though. Oh no.
And there's so many things you could do for that. Things like wombats poop square poops, stuff like that.
Whoa.
Like that sounds
There's a-
so made up.
There's a TikTok of a guy that presents them like a conspiracy theorist, like mannequin, to show how crazy you'd sound saying real facts if you were the first person to ever say it.
Well, and I do think that that's something that I always have it in the back of my head when communicating science on topics that are unfamiliar or
Mhm.
unusual, being aware of which things I'm saying that people are going to want to disbelieve.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I often find myself trying to be very sympathetic to people when they're like, "Hey, that thing that you just said, that's totally made up," or "I don't believe any of that." And I often have to go, "Well, yeah, I get it.
Mhm.
I absolutely, here's this cool new study that came out that found this super cool thing about this ancient animal or whatever. I fully understand why you would think that that's made up."
Yes.
Because
sounds too ridiculous to be
that
real.
sounds ridiculous. and recognizing those and then taking the time to go in and say, hey, absolutely, I get it. Let's go into a little more detail, because if we don't, you're going to think that we're making something up.
Yes.
And I think it's relatively easy to fall into that, particularly with paleontology, when you're talking about groups of life that aren't around anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know, things like, and I don't think I've ever talked about this group of animals on our podcast, but like things like the Tanystrophiids, they just look so ridiculous. And for Mike and Fia, it's basically, imagine the body of like a Komodo dragon, but with just a neck for miles. And they just look so ridiculous. Or things like, you know, with mammals being more my thing, Colicotheres.
Yep.
They just look so strange.
Well, I think that paleontology really does, one of the sort of ever-present challenges with science communication is just a general lack of trust in science that pops up on certain topics and in certain demographics or at certain times. And paleontology often does struggle with that, because we are often talking about things, we're talking about species that don't exist anymore. We're looking at just fossils, and it's very easy to see how people, especially if they're already a little bit critical for whatever reason, are going to make that jump to, well, that's ridiculous enough that it's easy for me to not believe that anyone could tell that thing about that creature.
A lot of the information that we learn and then share are things you can't see and touch.
Yes.
You know, with animals, you could actually go look up a video of an animal doing the thing you learned it can do.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that with any of the ones that are extinct.
And it sounds like a situation like what you all have on your podcast maybe is nice for some of those things, because you actually do have in many cases, a person explaining something that one or two of the other people are going to have a lot of questions about.
Yes.
And a lot of concerns maybe about the validity or about the believability, even if just in a joking way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, again, when occasionally I send different paleo art or depictions of different groups of animals, Mike in particular will very colorfully, you know, play it up, but kind of doubt.
I am still looking at the Google images for this.
Yeah. Again, lots of bizarre animals in the fossil record, and it's even more difficult for, you know, the uninitiated to have trust in some of these things, because for a lot of this stuff, we only have one or two of them.
Yeah, exactly.
And, you know, I'm very jealous of people like Fia, who it's like, hypothetically, getting your data is expensive, but you can always just go get more of it.
I don't. That's not true. That is not true.
Yes.
Real life science is not easy or glorious, and especially if you're doing time series data, you cannot get it back.
Yeah.
That's
makes
fair.
Sense.
I think that's another, you know, we talk a lot about paleontology. It's easy to get this reputation as being difficult or missing a lot of information. And while it has the danger of leading to people being skeptical of it, it also can run into the problem of making the assumption that similar difficulties aren't faced in other sciences.
Yes.
Which, of course, every science is
it's
going to have
totally
those
true.
complications.
Yeah. Right.
Which sounds like another one of those nice benefits of having a collection of hosts who can bring a variety of perspectives to the topics.
Right.
Yeah.
I was sort of going to ask about that with the paleontology people. Like, does when there's only one or two of a specimen or something, like, do you ever question like what we think we know, or what the generally scientific accepted view is? Are there ever times you're looking at something like, boy, I don't know if we have the data for this? Like, does that ever creep into your heads where you're like, I know this goes against what is generally accepted, but I don't know if I buy this?
Yeah, no, I've definitely seen studies that will make a claim and it's like 90% of what you said in this study, good on you. This sentence here,
right. There may not be enough data to say that confidently.
Right.
I'm not quite comfortable with how much we have to take that at face value.
One of the first papers that I read in grad school, so my first semester I took a phylogenetics class, and we read the paper that quote unquote brought back Brontosaurus as a valid genus. And that was not even the main point of that paper.
No.
Yeah.
That's like a footnote in that paper almost.
Yeah. And so we read it, And I was like, I looked through all their, character matrices just with my limited knowledge that I had up to that point in the class. I'm like, I don't know if I buy that. The rest of it, seems fine. And now everyone, of course, with something like Brontosaurus, there was 1,000 different articles written about it because it's Brontosaurus.
Yep.
And I again, getting to that sort of trying to correct people, maybe potentially when I shouldn't. I was like, maybe read the paper first.
Yep.
I think it totally, your question, Mike, it totally applies to my realm of science too. And I think it's always good to be like a little stitious whenever you're reading scientific articles. Like not a lot, but just a little, just keep that in check.
Because scientists aren't infallible, and we can get, overly excited or just too tunnel visioned on a thing and make a claim that's not quite ready to be made.
Yeah,
like it happens. That's why there's peer review. That's why then the scientific community can respond to that paper and say, well, please do these tests, and then we will be happy with what you said.
And I think that this ties back into our conversation before about being willing to admit when you don't know something or when something's beyond you. Also trying to be open about what sorts of conclusions, what sorts of data we can be confident in when they're still open, that not everything that's published in a scientific paper is set in stone now, so to speak, that there is always room for continued discussion about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
Having conversations that model the way that scientists talk about the things that we're studying.
I think that piece is huge, though, just like modeling, the way scientists talk about that, because there is also, the flip side, as we talked before about, some of the more malicious parts of the internet, that people aren't willing to engage in good faith. There is the having healthy skepticism or making sure you have the data to back something up. And then there's the people that in the face of data will just, reject any, conclusion because it doesn't conform, they
continue to question.
Yeah, right. Because they there are people that you can show all the data you want, and they will never believe in evolution or a vaccine or whatever the case is. And just trying to make sure that when you're having those kinds of discussions, and we've done this on our podcast at various times. I think Brontosaurus, that's come up on our podcast before. I'm almost positive.
Yeah.
Just like modeling those conversations as being based in evidence and facts and what we don't know, versus what is seen on the less scientific parts of the internet among people that will certainly talk about science like they know it, and just polluting the discourse and using that kind of lack of certainty or that skepticism that good scientists should have as a weapon against science as a whole. Science doesn't know everything, or the conventional view was wrong on this one thing one time, so we can throw out everything. And so just like you were saying, just making sure that those conversations are modeled the way scientists talk about is such a key piece of how to go about doing this.
I think sort of bringing it back full circle to how our podcast started, in 2020, when talking about COVID, the science was changing so rapidly that people who don't understand the actual inner workings of how science works were like, well, in April 2020, they told us don't wear masks. And then in July 2020, they told us to. What gives? And then just using that to mistrust any information given out by the health professionals throughout the entire rest of the pandemic. And then, you still see a ton of that on the internet around today. And that whole deal is why I wanted to, granted, I am not a medical person by any means.
Yeah.
But, if I could, a broader understanding of even my small pocket of science that I understand quite well out there, and talk about science as a process instead of an Excel spreadsheet of facts, then that was a big reason why I wanted to do the podcast to begin with.
Help with those tools of understanding science, not just learning facts from science.
Right.
Yeah, and modeling those conversations and that sort of discourse and critical thinking along the way. Gavin, Fia, Mike, thank you all so much for joining us. This has been a really fun discussion.
I feel like we could do another hour right now.
Just us, though. We'll just we'll turn the mic off, and then we'll just hang out all night.
We'll have a blast.
Absolutely. Before we wrap it up officially, please, any and all of you, take a moment to let our listeners know where they can find you, and anything cool you've got going on.
I'm going to beg you, please, none of you try and find me.
We'll
Good luck.
put Mike's home address down in the episode description. So
Every now
you
and again,
can
I'll have a
go-
student be like, "You have a podcast?" I'm like, "Nope, no, I do not."
But yeah, you can find us on most podcast platforms. I believe we're on pretty much everything, as well as we are on YouTube. That's probably the main best way to sort of interact with the podcast.
Gavin, what's the name of the podcast?
Thank you, Mike. It's called I Wish You Were Dead. And you can find it wherever pods are cast. And unfortunately, I'm not particularly great at the social media. So YouTube, if you want to, like, you know, get more involved or anything else, or, you know, pitch us ideas and feedback and stuff, YouTube comments is probably the best way to do that. We also do have various Google forms in the show notes of our show to fill out for topic ideas. We also have like a guest suggestion or guest quote unquote application form in the show notes of all of our episodes.
I really like to vouch to have guests. I really want to have more guests. So please,
Yes.
if you're listening and you want to be a guest, we would love to have you.
Yes,
Nice.
absolutely.
Yes.
Excellent. Listeners, go ahead and check out I Wish You Were Dead. We'll have some links down in the episode description for you to find more information. And also remember that Spotlight 2024 is a series we're doing all throughout the year. So there are several other conversations like this with other science communicators where we chat about science communication, podcasting, and the like. One more time, all three of you, thanks so much for being here and contributing to our series.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, of
Thank
course.
you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.